Hola a todos y a todas. Hay unas primeras palabras en español. I try at least. Gracias por tenerme acá y gracias Germán por la introducción y por la plataforma y también gracias a la Universidad de Palermo por esta oportunidad de compartir. Los viernes pasados siempre fueron muy interesantes y estoy muy feliz de ser parte de esa serie. Um, but lo siento, mi español no es suficiente para toda la presentación. Espero que mi inglés sea comprensible para todos y todas. De lo contrario, no duden en interrumpir y preguntar algo. So I will switch to English now because I guess it's easier. Yeah, like Germán said in the introduction, I felt that this series was a lot about showing new paradigms and new approaches towards architecture and not only in the practice itself, but also in the education, like in architectural school and in universities. And I felt I wanted to share a concept or a thought that has been kind of occupying me for some time now, and because of this, it has been kind of dictating the way I am thinking and therefore also working since I don't know, a few time, and that is the concept of or this idea of unlearning categorical thinking that Herman, he mentioned this in the introduction also. And this word to unlearn, I stumbled upon it a few, like, I don't know, let's say 2 years ago. And I mean, it's kind of a very basic, a very normal, very simple word to unlearn, nothing super complicated. But I felt that there was something very interesting in this word because I guess now everything is always about progress and going further and building up and constructing instead of maybe deconstructing or unlearning or questioning things that you have already learned that kind of brought you into a mental or thinking mode of thinking, dominant modes of thinking, instead of maybe going back and questioning if this kind of a concept. So I want to share a little bit these thoughts and maybe also the dynamics that come with this concept of unlearning by using some historical references, but also some personal projects. And I would like to start with a project that I did last year, and that was kind of the beginning of the whole project of unlearning. And I guess this is also why it is a good start for the presentation. And it is called, this project is called It's a Problem of Perception, and it all started with this short paragraph that you see here. And I wrote this paragraph last year when I had my very first more intense experience with the South American context. And I will read it to you, and then I will explain a little bit more how it was the entire beginning of let's say, the deconstruction of how I think, or at least how I try. So, it's a problem of perception. The motivation to act rises from our perception. Each action is thus subject to the individual consciousness of the world. Therefore, the field of perception provides a fundamental basis for the exchange of different imprints in the design disciplines. These disciplines are not just practices for shaping the environment, but above all, practices for shaping perception. The specificity of a context is made by transferring social and cultural behaviors into space. If one wants to understand the context, the foreign must be admitted first. However, in order not to have to face the complexity of other perspectives and therefore the foreign, the known is quickly put to the unknown. The transferring into a familiar context prevents us from learning from the unknown and keeps us from understanding that the specific can remain specific. Experiencing different contexts gives the chance to reveal one's own behavioral patterns and in juxtaposition shows social and cultural characteristics that manifest themselves in space and norm. Each context has its own definition of valuable or worthless, domestic or public, near or far, and supposedly set design parameters are always renegotiated. Experiences and perceptions of everyday life differ from time to time, from place to place, and from person to person. Individual imprints determine how one sees the world, which tools one uses to describe it, and by implication, how one shapes it. Sharing these views and tools of perception reveals readings that allow to explore the depths and complexity of our environment. When doing so, one might discover that what at first seems to be problems of societies could in the end be only a problem of perception. So this was the paragraph that kind of started everything, and especially like mentioning these parts where it talks about different definitions of valuable and worthless, different definitions of domestic and public, or what is perceived as near and far. I kind of had this experience comparing with definitions or experiences of space that I grew up with in like a very European context, and then entering a South American context, and I don't know, being questioned these definitions that can be something super simple as distance, where in the European context, maybe 200 or 300 kilometers might seem quite far or medium to far, whereas in the Argentinian context, for example, it is considered very close. But it is the same spatial distance and it is the same mathematical number, but it's kind of how we are being accustomed to certain phenomena. And this paragraph turned to be the breeding ground for an exhibition that I did along with a lot of very inspiring people from Buenos Aires that you can see most of them in the upper right corner box. Palca Estudio, Oficina, Lucia Legareta, Dario Grashinsky, Matias Nola, Carolina Cuixao, Jose Moroni, who is a photographer, and Thomas Teresa Menta. And with them together, from this paragraph or from this text, we decided to do an exhibition, also inviting studios like Studio Verta from Belgium and Soft Firm from the United States to broaden a little bit the context of contributions. And this exhibition took place in May 2019, so last year in Gela. I don't know if the people listening from Buenos Aires, if they are maybe familiar with this place. It is like a contemporary art center in Buenos Aires that also offers art residencies for artists worldwide. It is a great institution, and we were able to do this exhibition there. And the aim of this exhibition was to offer an environment where we could start unlearning this kind of categorical thinking, where we could start questioning the influence of space and objects in space on our on social dynamics, and also how the juxtaposition of different objects in space kind of interfere with our thinking. And we had all kinds of media. Like in this picture, you see there's photography, and there was quotes, and there were essays and papers, but also this experimental kitchen. We had video installations. So it was a very broad spectrum of mediums, but all of them kind of dealt with space. And one of the aims was to reveal like individual truth in individual readings, like to broaden the perspectives on what things can be in space, and to go beyond a single meaning of things. And a personal contribution to this exhibition was position of waters. That is the upper, this right colored big print that you see on the wall. And in position of waters, I like through the exploration of different contexts and through starting to think about unlearning, I wanted to deal with the space that is in between these different contexts, like dealing between, let's say, the European context and the South American context, so the space of the waters and the ocean and the sea, whereas this space of the ocean is probably one of the spaces that we as humans can least relate to, like up until now, because it is, I don't know, a space so I don't know, kind of far from our understanding. But it also holds incredible fascination, spatial fascinations, and hopes that we are wishing to receive on other sides of coasts, for example. And I also felt that at sea everything kind of begins, like the transferring of cultures, the transfer of knowledge, the exploration of diverse contexts. It kind of all starts at and through sea. So this is why I wanted to work with the ocean. And there is this quote or this excerpt of a German historian that he held a lecture, and it's a translation from German, so it's not his exact words, but I still felt that how he described the sea was very interesting, because he used a lot of spatial words, like spatial explanations, to describe this phenomena of the sea. And I will read it. It is the sea as a limiting experience. Since the early 19th century, man's perception of the sea has taken place in a field of tension, the poles of which form the terms knowledge and wonder. It was about the feelings that were triggered by the observation of the sea, and about the experience of limits. Perhaps the key to understanding the fascination of the sea lies here, the sea as a space for limiting experience. The sea appears to be, to us, boundless, and thus, in a sense, an antithesis to human existence. The sea as a fascination can therefore come in many different forms, as a sensation of a supposed boundlessness, or in view of its untamable elemental force that can never be tamed by humans. Others see the sea as a bridge to distant shores, where it is much better and freer to live than in the confines of European norms and conventions. These and other reasons have prompted millions of people to board ships and to cross the sea from Europe to foreign shores. If they survived seafaring, they carried European values and conventions, knowledge and ways of life all over the world, and those who returned did so with the knowledge and experience they had gained abroad and contributed to the increased knowledge and prosperity in Europe. But he had also learned to see Europe from the outside, through the eyes of others, which gradually helped Europeans to gain a better understanding of themselves. Europe discovered the world through the sea, and at the same time got to know itself. I don't know, I resonated a lot with this text while doing the exhibition also, because it has so many parallels with the exhibition when he talks about norms and conventions and how people were boarding ships in order to reach other shores, other countries, other destinations, in order to free themselves from certain norms and Europeans and conventions that they've been growing up with, or that they've been experiencing. So I thought it was a great link to the exhibition. And at this time, also, my interest in cartography got bigger, and while exploring oceans and the seas and cartography, I came across this phenomenon, this word that is called horror vacui, which is from the Latin and means fear of the empty space or fear of the empty. And I don't know, it was applied a lot in the 17th century, and it was an inspiration for position of waters also, because cartographers and artists would apply this term also to the seascapes in maps. Like you can see in this map, it has a lot of ships and monsters and nonsense objects or fantasy objects that they don't have anything to do with the certain location, or it's not that there are certain narratives or stories about certain ships in a certain position. It's just that they were afraid to leave this space empty, and so they just kind of filled it with things. And I thought that was very interesting, how they perceive the ocean as a space of emptiness. And to switch to a contemporary map from this 17th century map, this is the tool I used to make Position of Waters, that is the Earth Explorer from the US Geological Survey. And it's a website that contains a lot of satellites, that you can access satellite imagery from different satellites, and you can more or less select any kind of area on the planet and manipulate the satellites, and if you're lucky, you end up with very beautiful pictures. And since I wanted to explore the seascapes, I was trying to find pictures of the ocean, which was a little bit more difficult because satellite images usually, like, the interest of them is not usually to capture the oceans. So a lot of these satellite images, they are black and white, but I found these, and even though they were black and white, I don't know if the quality is good enough to see that there are certain patterns in these satellite images, and I thought maybe if I would start manipulating with them, I could find something interesting. And so that was kind of the end result out of these satellite images, after merging them into one picture and manipulating them in Photoshop. And one thing that I thought was very beautiful, that if you would go, it was quite a big image or print in the end, so if you would go very close, only by going very close, you would actually get a sense of the scale, because you would start seeing the movement of the water. And I don't know, it was something very beautiful that got revealed doing the process of, like, processing the images and the pictures. And I kind of also felt it looked a little bit like oil on canvas, like an oil painting. But anyways, these different ways of looking at the image, like from far and from near, and revealing the scale of the space, and therefore like a notion of distance. I thought it kind of related a lot how the real human perception of the sea is, as I don't know, when you're at the sea or when you're at the coast, you tend to lose your sensation for distance and for scale very easily. And I kind of felt that in the end, the image tried to do the same with playing, looking from at the image from far and looking at the image from close. And these are some other satellite images I found while exploring the satellites. And what I like about these satellite images, that most of the times they're kind of out of context. So you don't really look at a piece of land having, let's say, the entire Google Maps or map open that you can compare or relate to certain territories or countries or other contexts. So you kind of only get pieces and fragments of land masses and situations that I found this decontextualization I found very beautiful, because through this you kind of get a different view and a different perception on territory itself, and you kind of start questioning what is territory and how is it constructed, if you can look at land also in these kind of fragments. So you can, it was a very very beautiful coincidence to find some of these images. And looking at these let's say, decontextualized images of territory, and I was thinking about the Buckminster Fuller Dymaxion map that he did in 1943, because this map tries to do something similar. Like, he redesigned and reconstructed the world map, like taking it from this global ball-shaped kind of perception where the distortion of the countries sometimes make countries bigger than they actually are, or smaller than they actually are, or like put them into weird shapes that they actually don't have. So what he did with this new construction or new interpretation of a map, he put the countries in its real sizes and on these geometrical patterns. And the very interesting thing about this is you can also decontextualize it and put it into new context. So you can replace and re-put the positions of the land masses and the territories in the countries in order to get different readings of the world, which I find super interesting. And maybe one of my favorite ones is the map in the bottom left corner, where all of the countries and land masses are surrounding the ocean. So it's kind of, they are all connected by a big lake. I guess it's a different way of seeing the world, and maybe also one of the biggest scales to start unlearning our conventional way of reading and seeing the world. So I guess when I saw this, and after doing the exhibition, I was wondering even more, why do we actually need to unlearn? Like, where do all of these dominant ways of thinking come from? How are we being socialized in thinking something is valuable and something is not? And I kind of wanted to explore these roots of, let's say, Eurocentric thinking, or the Western kind of thinking, and like, what is it that shapes these, like, and I felt that one of the strongest ways how physical norms and therefore like mental norms are being created comes from the many spatial configurations that came with colonialism, like, because it's been shaping the globe physically, but also mentally, like, tremendously. And because with colonialism also it came this importance of territory, and also, I mean, territory not only in creating physical borders, but also in creating mental borders, limits and limitations and interpretations and ways of seeing the world. So I want to show, to explore a little bit around these events. And if you compare this map to the Buckminster Fuller map, I feel you kind of immediately, like, or you cannot oversee the different intentions that they have. Whereas in this chart of the world from 1871, you see the settler or colonial trade routes that they all start and originate in Europe, and then they exploit and explore the world from there. So this map kind of shows this Eurocentric way of seeing the world. You start reading the world from Europe, and what is very interesting in colonialism is like how they dealt with space, what kind of influence they had on space and landscape and architecture. Not only the very interesting thing about colonialism is that they do it simultaneously in both ways. They shape it physically in the real world, but they also shape it mentally in the thinking back home in their homelands or home countries, in their metropolis of colonial metropolises. And I don't know, these kind of it is these things, that the two processes that happen at the same time. You have the shaping of the world according to the European ideas of how the world should be or should look like. And then you also have this transmission of knowledge that they found while exploring the world and then bringing it back to the European country. So you have the unification of the world according to their ideas, and then the formation of the Eurocentric thinking, or let's say like the beginning of this kind of categorical thinking that I was talking about in the beginning. And one quote that I want to read from Luciana de Lima Martins, she's Brazilian, and she's wrote a paper on mapping tropical waters, and she explains on a more specific example here the tropical zones, how I guess British settlers formed and shaped, they kind of had an idea of what tropicality should be like, what the tropics should look like, and they've been exploring the tropics, but then also wanting to intensify their idea of what is tropicality really. So she says, a distinctive feature of the European vision of the tropics was the commercial project to relocate plants between different tropical territories in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, an exchange only feasible by sea. Images of landscape, together with exotic species and commodities, circulated through the tropic, resulting in the composition of the hybrid tropical landscape and more generalized idea of tropicality. I know it is one of the very important words maybe in this quote is also this word generalized, like a generalized idea of something. And I feel probably even today, or still today, we have this problem within cities and architecture, that we have kind of generalized spaces instead of specific places, assuming that global norms are kind of opposed to local specificities. And if you look more in detail to these kind of plans that the settlers were exchanging and translocating and delocating in this tropical zone, or let's say in the entire world, you kind of start to wonder how actually would the world or the globe or the landscapes that we know, the landscapes that shape our identities, would look like. Because I don't know, the Malaysia, a big part of Indonesia, lives from rubber plantations, and most of the landscapes are shaped through rubber plantations, while as the rubber plant originated in Brazil. Or Brazilian coffee, that is kind of part of the industry and economy in Brazil, but also part of the identity. It didn't like originate in Brazil, so they kind of swapped and interchanged and displayed different species, creating huge landscape design. I don't know, you can put it like this. And what I meant in the beginning, talking about colonialism, that you have this physical shaping, but what you see here with these tropical botanical studies is that at the same time they were registering these plants, they were archiving these plans, they were like drawing them very, very precisely into a great amount. So they were producing these kind of images, and what the production of these images creates is that it is the visualization of their power of knowledge, because like this, they were showing we are the only people investigating, exploring the world. We are the only people perceiving. We are the only people understanding the values of certain things, and so this is why we can put values on things and devaluize other things. And I want to show more of these examples, because you can also see these influence in the thinking, let's say the European or colonial thinking, in paintings from seamen or settlers. This is another painting from Brazil. And the production and circulation of these paintings shaped to an enormous extent the thought of the people in the world. And here are some more, like they produced in in great numbers. But what is also, like, what you see by these paintings is another quote of the same author. That she says, by rendering alien forms familiar, they could reference a common geographical imagination. Unknown forms were molded into a hybrid landscape composed of interchangeable tropical elements of the British maritime way of seeing. Architectural features and elements of vegetation were interchangeable within the hybrid landscape of this tropical zone. So what is interesting here also, she uses a lot of terms that I guess we as architects or urban designers or designers are quite familiar with, like to render, to mold, to compose. So they've been really not only physically but mentally designing the world, designing landscape, but to their perspectives and to their way and wishes of how it should look like. So in this extent of, I don't know, over the course of 400 years of colonialism, it is incredible and probably even like impossible to imagine a pre-colonial world, like the landscapes that we know now and that shape identities and economies of certain of certain countries, probably most countries in the world. And another important tool that maybe we as architects are also very familiar with, that settlers in colonialism used, is the diorama. That is a three-dimensional full-size or miniature model. So to say, it is a model or atmospherical representation of a context and of a certain atmosphere, of a culture, of a territory they've been experiencing, and that they wanted to take this knowledge and transfer it to Europe in order to show people at home how the world looks like abroad, outside of Britain, let's say Britain or other colonies. So the diorama stages human knowledge of the world, not without influencing and perpetually challenging the viewer's perception. And maybe the one in the bottom corner is a diorama more known. Like you usually see them in maybe history museums, or they also come a lot in glass boxes. They show habitats mostly, to show how people live in other contexts. And in the age of colonialism, dioramas served as a propaganda tool and for the political justification of hegemonic power struggles. All right. So another one of these spatial representational tools that colonialism and settlers used was the panorama, like despite the diorama that I was showing. And panoramas may be something that you're also quite familiar with, and this is a panorama of Rio de Janeiro. And this quote is great because it talks about something I feel is very important to consider, that this dominance usually came in the disguise of art, traveling narratives and accounts, capturing during expeditions, turned into collections in London. We can identify a range of material culture produced specifically within this context, which aimed to inform people at home of what existed in the world outside Britain. Throughout the long 19th century, scientific discourse helped building images of otherness, crafting ideas about different races, geographical determinism, and territorial conquests, all in order to make the uneven dominance to appear as natural to the eyes of those who lived in the cultural and economic capitals. This discourse relates to the panoramas and natural exhibitions, as they treated the world as an identifiable area of objects to be collected or painted and visually processed as knowledge, and helped to build the images of other places and people. So I feel a lot of the things that I've been saying before, like the last highlighted sentences and also this fragment of building image of otherness, brings it very, like, emphasizes this kind of thing of otherness, and that I feel we still experience this today, or even like much to a different extent, that certain architectural and spatial standards are held for more valuable or more worthy than others. There's like a never-ending, like some contexts and some standards are like a never-ending reference, instead of opening up the references and opening up the perspectives on things. And then these paintings even got installed in special architecture, like in special buildings that they were created or constructed for, in this case, for the panoramas, in order to reinforce the illusion they wanted to create of how is the world from the eyes of Europe. And I guess this is probably the most obvious or the most known and even the most branded reminder of colonialism in the world. That is the colonial architecture, because you can find it maybe in certain modifications, but you can find it kind of all over the world, even in the most hidden places. There is a city, a church, a settlement, where you can kind of trace back the origins of this architecture. And coming from these historical origins of dominant concepts that I showed through colonialism, let's say, I want to share now some more projects to show, or I don't know, to get an idea of how architecture and design today could help to unlearn how we've been socialized to think about space, to perceive space, what kind of space in architecture is valuable and worthful, and whatnot. And one of these projects is Kitchen is Kitchen from Flora Officina, that I don't know if you remember in one of the first slides where I showed the exhibition at Cela, and this kitchen was part of this exhibition. And this kitchen wanted to question the dominant spatial formulation and like contextualization of the kitchen, and also to explore it more as a space of new encounters and of social encounters. And if you look at the kitchen, I guess you kind of have to look at the Frankfurter Küche, the Frankfurter kitchen that was designed and constructed by two German architects in the 1920s. In this kitchen, I mean, I don't want to put a negative light on the kitchen, because it was designed very carefully and with a lot of quality and thought, and also affordable for even lower budgets, which was very important in this time. But what I want to highlight or focus on in this kitchen here is that it was designed for efficiency, and it was designed for like as an industrial workspace for one person. So this efficiency, you can also see it in the floor plan with these lines that they kind of trace production, or they trace the efficiency lines of movements in the kitchen. And so therefore the elements in the kitchen were also they were set in one position, like they had its set place in the kitchen, like every element was set. And my collaboration with this project was a paper that I wrote together with Facu Fernandez on this project that is going to be published in Room Journal. It is like a new editorial from British Columbia, Canada. And the first issue was on the bathroom, and the second issue that is coming this fall is on the kitchen. And there you will find the paper on the Kitchen is Kitchen. And I will read a short excerpt of this paper. To understand the kitchen outside of its prevailed context as a space of social encounters that starts developing its own dynamics through its users, its spatialization today must be questioned. Through decontextualizing and reinterpreting Kitchen is Kitchen wants to explore the kitchen as a place of emotion and sensuality. The project addresses the translation of behaviors into space, as well as the mutual influence and determination of design and spatial dynamics. What makes the kitchen a generator of social gatherings, and can its design influence the course of encounters? Which limits and roles of domesticity have to be reached in order to understand the kitchen in all its potential? Gottfried Semper's description of the hearth or the fireplace as a moral and spiritual element of architecture and its transition towards the worldly importance of food processing gives an idea of the potential value and capability of the kitchen sphere. And the mentioned reference of Gottfried Semper comes from his book, The Four Elements of Architecture. And with this, we kind of wanted to connect the project to his theory of what is the role of the fireplace within architecture, and I don't know, to explore the possible origins of the kitchen and how it was connoted then, and what was the meaning, and what if these meanings remain, maybe what is lost. And Semper states that, I'm going to read the highlighted part, around the hearth, the first groups formed. Around the hearth, the first groups assembled. Around it, the first alliances formed. Around it, the first root religious concepts were put into the customs of a cult. So he says that the fireplace and the hearth, so maybe the origins of the kitchen, was the first element to be created within architecture, and then everything around it was constructed. And he also says it's not only, he doesn't describe it as a part of food processing, he describes it as a social place where groups are being formed. And when he shows, or when he talks about the fireplace or the hearth, he usually refers to this Caribbean hut, like the drawing of this Caribbean hut, as a more primal form of architecture. And in the floor plan, you can see a black circle that is in the center of the building that he describes as the place where food processing took place, and that is occupying the center of the space, meaning that it is occupying an important role within social life. And in these videos, you can also see the importance of food preparation as a social event that kind of generates different dynamics depending on the settings and depending on the objects being used. I hope that you can see the video well. But here in this Iranian thing, you see the space is incredible. And here the women, they meet in a, it says it is a community kitchen, so the women, they meet here to cook together, to prepare bread together. And what is great is that you see here they actually use the building to cook. They use the floor to cook. They use the walls to cook. So they kind of interact in a very special and different way with the building in order to prepare food in a social event also. And then the second video, Reminiscence of a Journey to Lithuania from Jonas Mekas. So you see here, he is focusing on the different objects that they're going to be involved in the cooking process. So it's kind of an introduction of characters in a movie, more or less, like introduction of personality. So what he's doing with the focusing on the different elements is kind of giving personality to the objects that they're going to be used, and like a personification of elements. And I feel kind of that there was a relation to the Kitchen is Kitchen project, because the elements by itself also become kind of a personificated. And then the last video is an outtake of a Georgian cooking show. It's not really a show, it's like they show traditional ways of cooking in Georgia. And actually you can see very similar objects being used compared to the Jonas Mekas documentary. But what I find interesting in this video is the dynamic in this space is totally different, even though the objects, maybe they seem to be quite similar. But the arrangements of the objects kind of create a different environment and therefore create a different dynamic in it. But I mean, it's also a staged cooking, so I guess you kind of also have to consider this. And looking at these different elements and seeing how even similar elements, but in different settings and arrangements, create different dynamics, I kind of want to talk about context, because we understand in these videos, we understand the elements and the objects that they are being used because we are also being introduced to its context. We are being introduced to this Iranian architecture and environment, being introduced to the Lithuanian context, and being introduced to the Georgian context. But without these contexts, we kind of go back to, let's say, our categorical thinking, to putting the stool, the bench, the floor, the wall back into, I don't know, our one-sided interpretation or perspective of it. Like a stool to sit alone, a bench to sit with many, a floor for support, a wall for protection, but you kind of lose the broadening of perspective of what it could be without the context. And context is interesting because I feel with like whether one knows is somehow relative to context. So with different contexts come also different truths. Objects, elements, architecture, space changes when we change the context. And I feel it would be very enriching for architecture and design if we would consider the context like more important, and like to observe and explore and understand the context more in relation to the social life that happens within these contexts. And to explore this further, I've founded a little publishing house that is called Club, together with Facu Fernandez and Dario Brzezinski. And this publishing house wants to explore these kind of contexts of daily architecture. And maybe to explain it a little bit more from a different perspective, I want to share this Estonian artist. He's a landscape photographer, Alexander Gronsky. And I think what is great about his work is that he questions common interpretations through context in a very interesting way. Like in this series, Pastoral, he shows open spaces, green spaces. You're usually in a very close proximity to something urban, to the city. I guess this is all the Russian countryside, and how these people use and also abuse these places that they kind of are free for them to use. And it is a different understanding of what is a beach in this context, what is the city in this context, what is nature in this context, and how is it being used and perceived. And I am very what we see in these landscapes and in this nature is definitely not what the people who use them in their daily life see them. And probably these kind of alterations and these kind of modifications of landscape can also be shown as a type of resistance in terms of claiming territory. And no, I feel one other example that I could observe about resistance is I don't know, learning from the intuitive response and needs and desires of social actors living within certain contexts and environments. And that another type of resistance that I was able to experience here in Brazil is the domestic demonstrations here in Brazil. They are called paneladas, and I guess the Argentinian people who are listening, they know it as cacerolazos. So it is more familiar in the South American context, but less familiar in a European context, where people start demonstrating hitting on pots and pans from their balcony and windows, so kind of from their domestic place, but in collective. This has been happening here a lot since the start of the pandemic, or the rise of the pandemic, because of the actions of the president here. And I found this phenomenon, well, I mean, the reality that it has to happen is extremely sad, but I found that there is a beauty in the process, or in the moment that is being created within these demonstrations. That I wrote a little paragraph about it that is called My Sphere, Their Sphere, Our Sphere. A new sphere emerges eruptive. It is successively constructed of all that is domestic. A space of belonging, of loss, of resistance, of reclaim, of discovery, of oneself in a city, by the window or on the balcony, where one settles and hopes, where one settles and lives, where one is moved. A sphere like the street, like the square, like the park. A space that arises from the voices of all. A space that arises from the voices of all. One knows that one is part of a moment, a society, a city, when a new space in it is being created together. I guess this is probably the most interesting thing about these panelazos, like in spatial or in architecture terms of thinking, maybe, that you're all sitting at home in your private, like in your apartment, in your living room, in your kitchen, whatever, but you're collectively creating a space that kind of happens vertically outside through your windows, and that is like a public space, but I don't know, perceived or started from your very private space. I thought that is very interesting. And maybe one spatial feature or architectonic feature that emphasizes this a little bit more here in Brazil, and maybe also in the Argentinian context, but here in Brazil, I find it incredible how diverse the windows are in Brazil. Maybe as a Brazilian, maybe this is something very, very common and daily and normal, but as a German, we don't really experience the diversity of these windows, and especially not the diversity of how you're able to interact and engage with windows, like how you turn them and flip them and slide them. There is a multitude of interactions with windows, and this is why I started to register some of the windows I like here in Brazil. Maybe also because I feel it is the way of how you interact with the window could be the start of how you interact with the city, like to how you really engage and use the sphere and the space between the private and public, not in only simply open it, but the way you open it and the way you design. And this process, I feel, is quite beautiful here in Brazil. This is another example where this kind of turn, huge windows, actually the glass panels are very big, and they have a very interesting way of opening, and maybe this is this kind of interaction of how you engage with the window, and then maybe how you project this on your interaction with the city. I find it very interesting. As one last project that I want to show is the social clubs and the Club Social, Deportivo y Cultural that you have in Argentina, because they are especially interesting for me as a German, because in Europe you don't really find kind of typologies and institutions. But then looking especially at the clubs in Argentina, I find it very interesting that, I don't know, the majority of the Argentinian population now is made or comes from like a migration background, from especially from the European background or Southern European background. But in Europe, you can find these kind of social clubs. And to be fair, this is not a, like specifically a small historical club, but Peva, that is in the center of the city. And what is interesting about this space is that it is extremely complex, and you have like, it also has a very like, the spaces are extremely abstract, but you can see these movements that they are happening simultaneously. You have people walking in this passage on the left side, interacting with the kiosks and the restaurants, while at the same time you have this open gym on the other side. So different kinds of movements happening in one space at the same time. And these are just some more impressions of Jeva that I found show this spatial diversity and dimension of this club. And it's kind of been started to become a personal investigation project or a personal research project of social clubs. And this is a video of Javier Agostino that is extremely beautiful and showing Club Italiano, that is in Avenida Rivadavia, also in the capital of Buenos Aires. This very, very beautiful historical building that is still in use for different kinds of events, and also very daily events like these kids practicing sports. And it has, as you can see in the video, it has a very similar dynamic and movement, that you have people passing in the passageway, going to other events and spaces while they are exercising in the center of the space. This is another picture of Javier, showing these kind of different worlds coming together in this historical building, and then now the practices today. And what is actually quite sad but interesting to see is how the space of Club Italiano was in 1950. It kind of stretches along the entire block. I don't know if you can see it very well, but there is a white outline that outlines all the spaces of the club, that was made out of different compositions of different building parts and patios, a very beautiful and also complex building part. And this is how it is now, or like 2017, it kind of shrank, and they've been demolishing lots of parts, and even covering the two sides of the entries, like to the left and to the right of the entry. There used to be these little gardens, and now they are also being filled in with shops. And what is interesting about this transformation is that not only maybe the possible interpretation and meanings of what is the role of a social club now in the modern city, or in the contemporary city, but also what it like what it says and what it tells about the city itself, the expansion, and how the densification of the blocks, and the manipulated architecture. And this is the club how it used to be, what I said, with the two gardens to the left and the right of the entrance. And then this is kind of how you find it today, with the two shops, and you just kind of have the entrance remaining. And what another, like the clubs are also interesting in very different levels of scales, that in the not in the metropolitan area, actually in the capital of Buenos Aires, you have over 250 social clubs that they are spread all over the city, and they work, let's say, in three different scales or levels. That they work at the city level, where they're connected through tournaments, but also they have benefits in taxes, and they are having better accessibility of participations within other programs and events in the city. So they are part of a teachers program. So they work interactively on the city level. But at the same time, they have the district level, because more or less each district of Buenos Aires has at least one, if not, as you can see, more social clubs. And so they kind of act as a social actor and a mediator between like culture, heritage in the neighborhood, and they are also like very deeply rooted within the neighborhood. They have a very strong connection with the neighborhood. Probably even without the neighborhood, they couldn't even exist. But at the same time, they have a very strong spatial configuration and atmosphere in the building level. They have different programs, and let's say the implementation of each building in the urban fabric of the city tells also stories about the city of Buenos Aires itself. And through this investigation, I got in contact with, and also through Facu Fernandez, in contact with Ignacio Núñez, that and now together with the two of them, we are designing or having the chance to propose a new building for the Club Libertad de Huila that is in the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires. And I am super excited about this project because I've been fascinated with the Argentinian social clubs for a while now in the spaces of the buildings. So now having the opportunity to really design one of these clubs, yeah, I'm very grateful for this. And well, to explain a little bit, this project is the land of this project is very long and very narrow, and at the same time, clubs, they don't have big resources, so they kind of wanted to have this project being able to construct it in phases, so step by step, so they can kind of manage their budgets a little bit better. And so what we did is we took the building and we separated more or less in 3 or 2 parts. That you have the building in the front facing the street that could be built in a first phase together with a whole structure that is the circulation and the accessibility of the building with the staircase. And then in a third phase or in a second phase, you could build the last part of the building, so the back volume. And the separation of these volumes through a patio allows not only like ventilation of air, but also the light coming into this very long and narrow lot, which is kind of necessary. And its narrowness, it was also more difficult to create bigger spaces for events and social gatherings, which is super important for a club. So we decided to create a lot of open spaces that here maybe you can see starting from the street. It continues into the building, and then if you wanted to, you could even open the facade to the patio and create like this very long strip where social events and exhibitions, etc. can happen, fairs that they do. And one thing that also wants to contribute to this is the facade, that it lifts in the front. So when you open this polycarbonate facade up, the whole building immediately opens. And I guess this relation with the neighborhood is super important. Like I said in the graphic before, a club kind of needs the neighborhood, this interaction with the neighborhood. And another feature of this polycarbonate facade is that it creates this kind of translucent conversation with the neighborhood, that when you are inside the building, you're able to see the neighborhood from all kinds of levels within the building, but at the same time, especially during the night when you have the lights on in the building and activities happening in the building, the neighborhood is also able to see what is happening inside the building. So I guess this was also a very important conceptual idea working with the club. And I guess that was my last slide, and I hope it wasn't too long. But yeah, so this is it.